When Arina Sabalenka discovered she'd been downgraded, she didn't hold back. Her voice, raw, unfiltered, furious, echoed through the press room in ways the WTA never anticipated. Suddenly, it wasn't just about tennis anymore. It was about fairness, power, and whether the system protecting the sport's elite could survive scrutiny from its rising stars. Nobody saw this coming, and nobody was prepared for what she would say next. The morning began like any other on the women's tennis calendar. Emails arrived, rankings updated, draw sheets circulated. But beneath the mundane administrative choreography of professional sport lay a decision that would fracture the fragile equilibrium between players and the institution that governed them. Arina Sabalenka had finished the previous season ranked number 3 in the world. Her resume spoke volumes: multiple Grand Slam runs, victories over the sport's fiercest competitors, consistency that rivaled any player on tour. She'd earned her placement through sweat, sacrifice, and the merciless mathematics of tournament results. By every conventional metric, she'd proven herself indispensable. Yet when the WTA released its seeding for the upcoming major championship, something felt incomplete. Sabalenka found herself listed at number 7. 7. The discrepancy wasn't marginal. It wasn't a matter of 1 or 2 positions. It was a tumble that suggested the governing body had made a deliberate choice, one that defied transparent explanation. Within moments, her social media erupted. Within hours, the tennis world split into factions of confusion and outrage. What made this moment particularly sting was timing. Sabalenka had invested everything into returning from injury, fighting through tournaments, rebuilding momentum. The seeding wasn't arbitrary. Seeding wasn't ceremonial. It directly determined her path through the draw, the caliber of early opponents, the psychological weight of facing higher-ranked competition prematurely. A questionable seeding decision could reshape an entire tournament narrative before a single point was struck. The WTA, when pressed for clarification, offered vague justifications, references to recent form, comments about surface-specific performance, bureaucratic language that sounded official without actually explaining anything. It was precisely the kind of opacity that had plagued women's tennis for decades, decisions made behind closed doors, presented as fait accompli, left to players to absorb or protest. But Sabalenka had never been the type to absorb quietly. Her team immediately reached out for clarification. The responses were circular, bureaucratic, unhelpful. Nobody could point to a specific regulation that justified the demotion. Nobody could articulate a transparent methodology. They simply had decided. That's how it worked at the institutional level. Players were expected to accept, to move forward, to focus on matches rather than seeding mathematics. Except Sabalenka wasn't built to accept. She was built to question, and she was about to do both, publicly. The press conference began as it always did. Journalists queuing with microphones, the camera flashes creating a strobe effect against the backdrop. Sabalenka sat composed, her hands folded on the table, her expression neutral. She'd given hundreds of these conferences. She knew the choreography. For the first 15 minutes, everything remained professional. Match analysis, tournament outlook, the standard phrases. But then someone asked about the seeding. What happened next was inevitable. "I want to be respectful," she began, her accent cutting through the room's ambient noise, "but I need to be honest about what I'm seeing here." Her posture shifted, subtle but decisive. Her eyes narrowed. The WTA comes out and tells us rankings matter. They spend billions promoting rankings, building systems around rankings, telling sponsors and broadcasters that rankings determine everything. And then when it's convenient, when a decision serves their narrative, suddenly rankings don't matter anymore. Her voice escalated, not necessarily in volume, but in intensity. Each word carried weight. "I finished last season ranked 3. That's not opinion, that's fact. I beat top players, I won tournaments, I did everything the system asked. So now I want someone to explain to me, Clearly, not with corporate language, why I'm suddenly 7, because nobody has given me a real answer. And you know what? That's insulting. That's insulting to every player who thinks rankings mean something. The room had gone completely silent. This wasn't theater. This was genuine frustration, channeled with precision. I'm not complaining because I didn't get my way, she continued, her voice steely. I'm speaking up because if they can do this to me, they can do this to any of us. And if we all just accept it, if we're all too worried about sponsorships or media relationships to say anything, then the system becomes whatever they want it to be. Not what we agreed to, not what the rankings say, what they decide on a Tuesday afternoon in an office somewhere. She paused, her chest rising with a deep breath. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to pretend that doesn't matter. So yes, I'm going to keep asking questions. I'm going to keep pushing, because someone needs to. The implications of those statements reverberated immediately. This wasn't a player gracefully accepting an administrative decision. This was a world-class athlete directly challenging the legitimacy of the institution governing her sport, and doing so in front of every major media outlet on the planet.
The internet metabolizes controversy faster than any biological organism. Within hours, Sabalenka's comments had generated millions of impressions, thousands of think pieces, endless debate across every social platform imaginable. But the reaction wasn't monolithic. It fractured along predictable lines, yet also revealed surprising fissures. Tennis analysts, the ones with decades of institutional experience, largely supported her. They understood ranking systems. They understood what seeding meant. They recognized that discrepancies between ranking and seeding required transparent justification, not corporate hedging. Former champions lent their voices to her cause, each bringing accumulated credibility and perspective. I've seen this happen before, said one legendary player in an interview, and it always comes down to the same thing. Someone in power made a decision they couldn't defend, and now they're hoping nobody pushes back hard enough to expose it. But support wasn't universal. Some commentators suggested Sabalenka was being unprofessional, disruptive, ungrateful for the opportunities women's tennis had provided. These voices, often older, often male, often with financial ties to the WTA, cautioned against players challenging the system and warned that her outburst could damage the sport's image. That framing itself became controversial. Why should questioning administrative decisions be perceived as damaging? Why was transparency seen as threatening? These became the actual conversation, layering complexity onto the original dispute. The seeding decision had been the spark, but the real fire burning was about power, voice, and whose interests women's tennis was actually serving. Sponsors began making subtle calculations. Some quietly withdrew from provisional partnerships, unwilling to navigate the controversy. Others doubled down on Sabalenka, recognizing that her willingness to speak truth carried enormous appeal to younger, more socially conscious consumers. Brands attempting to appear progressive found themselves aligning with her stance. Brands comfortable with the status quo distanced themselves. The WTA issued a statement, carefully worded, maddeningly vague, appearing to address concerns without actually conceding any point. It referenced comprehensive evaluation processes, multiple data points, and commitment to fairness. Every word was immunized against criticism through abstraction. Sabalenka's response was a single tweet. Comprehensive evaluation processes are supposed to be transparent. That's what makes them comprehensive, not classified. That tweet received over 2 million engagements within 12 hours. What began as a seeding dispute rapidly morphed into something far more consequential, a referendum on institutional integrity itself. Investigative journalists started pulling threads. They examined historical seeding decisions. They compared rankings to tournament placements across decades. What emerged was a pattern. subtle but undeniable, suggesting that seeding decisions sometimes favored certain players while disadvantaging others, often in ways that correlated with media marketability, sponsorship value, or personal relationships with WTA decision-makers rather than actual performance metrics. Sabalenka's case wasn't an anomaly. It was a visible instance of a systemic practice that had operated in relative darkness for years. The real question, wrote one analyst, isn't why Sabalenka was downgraded. The real question is, how many times has this happened to players without her platform to contest it? How many lesser-known competitors have accepted unfavorable seedings because they lacked the visibility to challenge the decision? How many careers have been subtly altered by administrative choices made behind closed doors? These questions contaminated the discourse in ways the WTA hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about Sabalenka anymore. It was about every player who'd ever wondered if their ranking accurately reflected their position, every competitor who suspected they were disadvantaged by forces beyond their control. Player representatives began requesting formal meetings with WTA leadership. The Players Association, which had historically maintained complicated relationships with the WTA, sometimes advocating fiercely, sometimes deferring, found itself energized by Sabalenka's willingness to demand accountability. "This is what needs to happen," said one association representative in a televised interview. "Players need to use their platforms to ask difficult questions, not for personal benefit, but because the system depends on legitimacy. The moment players stop trusting that seedings reflect actual rankings, the moment they believe decisions are being made for opaque reasons, the entire structure loses credibility." The WTA's leadership found itself in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. They couldn't defend the decision because no defensible rationale had ever been articulated. They couldn't retreat from it without appearing incompetent. They couldn't ignore it because Sabalenka, with her massive following, her credibility as an elite competitor, her willingness to speak directly, had ensured the question would persist indefinitely.
3 weeks into the controversy, the WTA announced a comprehensive review of its seeding protocols. It was framed as routine evaluation and optimization, but everyone understood the context. Sabalenka had forced their hand. The review examined decades of seeding decisions. It interviewed former WTA executives, current administrators, and prominent players. It analyzed patterns. It sought to determine whether systematic bias existed, and if so, how extensively it had penetrated decision-making processes. The findings, when finally released, were damning in their understatement. The report acknowledged that seeding decisions occasionally incorporated considerations beyond ranking data, that transparency in the justification process required improvement, and that clearer protocols would benefit all stakeholders. This bureaucratic language masked a genuine reckoning. The WTA had been exposed, and while it would never admit wholesale corruption, the review confirmed what Sabalenka had always argued. The system had operated without adequate oversight, transparency, or accountability. But something else happened during this period. Players around the world started speaking up about similar experiences. Instances where they'd felt disadvantaged by seeding decisions, moments where they'd accepted unfavorable placements because challenging the system felt futile. Stories accumulated, creating a narrative tapestry that vindicated Sabalenka's original frustration. "I accepted a terrible seeding 2 years ago," one player revealed in an interview. "I knew it didn't match my ranking, but I was terrified that pushing back would mark me as difficult, someone who didn't respect the institution. Seeing Arena stand up and refuse to accept that narrative, it gave me permission to be angry about something I'd tried to ignore." That permission became contagious. The fear that had historically silenced player critiques began dissolving. If the WTA could be challenged successfully, if questioning authority didn't automatically result in retaliation, then the power dynamic shifted fundamentally. Sabalenka's credibility emerged strengthened. She'd been right. She'd articulated something genuine. She'd pushed hard enough that institutions had been forced to examine themselves. She'd done it without being dismissive or disrespectful, but also without softening her conviction or accepting corporate language as adequate response. Standing in the aftermath, the real consequences become apparent. The WTA's credibility has been fractured in ways that new protocols won't repair instantly. The relationship between players and administrators has fundamentally altered, and the question of whether institutions can be trusted to govern fairly, based on transparent criteria and defensible logic, remains more contested than ever. For Sabalenka personally, the victory is real but incomplete. She got her conversation, she got institutional acknowledgement that her concerns were valid. She didn't get an apology, and she didn't get her ranking/seating discrepancy retroactively resolved, but she got something perhaps more valuable. She demonstrated that silence isn't required, that accountability can be demanded, that a single player with conviction can challenge entrenched systems. The broader implications extend across women's sports. Every player who watched this unfold now understands something fundamental. Institutions count on silence. They depend on athletes accepting their authority without question. The moment that assumption fractures, the moment one player says, "That's not acceptable," momentum becomes possible. What does this mean for women's tennis specifically? It means the era of opaque institutional decision-making has ended. It means future administrators will need to justify their choices with transparent criteria. It means players have discovered their collective power and are unlikely to forget it. It also means the conversation isn't finished. It's barely begun. Questions about representation, about whose interests the WTA actually serves, about how much influence sponsors should have, about whether the current ranking system truly reflects competitive ability, these questions are now permanently on the table. Sabalenka, by refusing to accept institutional language and demanding clarity, has created space for genuine transformation. Whether the WTA will actually transform, whether this moment becomes a turning point or a temporary disruption that eventually fades, that remains to be determined. But one thing is certain. Women's tennis will never return to the comfortable opacity it inhabited before, because now everyone knows that asking why isn't disrespectful. It's necessary.